Now, as no one who's been trying to find somewhere to live in London will need reminding, the cost of property in the capital has gone berserk. One agency reported today that asking prices had gone up over 10% between September and October. The British obsession with home ownership is part of the reason, so too perhaps is the government's Help to Buy scheme. But it is also quite clear that many foreigners are frantic to buy property in London, and in so doing, the city is being made unaffordable to many. Before we talk about it, Verity reports.
Whose housing boom is it? For 4 years, the rest of the UK has watched as prime property in central London behaved like it was part of a different country. Price booms in the past began in central London and then rippled out to the rest of the UK. But in the capital, they've risen 60% since 2009. The rest of London, let alone the country, has some catching up to do.
If you look at the stamp duty take from the two central London boroughs, so Kensington and Chelsea and City of Westminster, in 2012-2013 that was a staggering £708 million, and that is £78 million more than Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales and the North East and the North West and Yorkshire and Humber put together.
Who are the buyers who can afford prime central London property? The latest research shows 49% of them aren't British nationals. The biggest chunk are from other European countries, followed by buyers from Russia and the former Soviet Union countries. Close behind are buyers from the Middle East, followed by Americans, Asians, and the rest of the world. To rich international investors, London property means financial safety.
Initially, it was an exchange rate play, people trying to cash in at the bottom of the market and weak sterling. Thereafter, a lot of it's being driven by a safe haven play, so uncertainty in the Eurozone looking for alternative investments, driving a lot of wealth into London. And then I suppose we also have a lot of wealth being generated in relatively immature markets where they're very keen to put their money into a safe, secure and well-known asset. And prime central London ticks all of those boxes.
But international buyers are starting to go off central London. Prices rose just 8% in the last year. Central London is so awash with money looking for a home that it's pushed prices up to the point where you can't really make money. If you bought one of these modest-sized flats for probably £1 million, you might collect a rent of 30 grand a year. That's a 3% return. Not much better than a savings account. And don't forget, you're taking a risk with your money. Now, those international buyers are copying an old British habit, getting on the tube and heading further out of town in search of better value for money. Welcome to London's latest house price hotspot. A stone's throw from West Ham's football ground, it may not always have been a magnet for buyers, foreign or domestic, but it's one of the few places in London where you might get a house for less than £250,000. To use a local expression, I am not taking the mickey. If you judge an economy by house prices, Plaistow is booming. Prices here are up by 15% since January, and agents say they're accelerating. On the weekend, more than 30 people were booked in to see this 3-bed terrace on offer at 240 grand.
Hello, welcome. Come in.
In a seller's market like this, there's no need to tidy up. Buyers are looking for what's known as potential. Kaylee Field and Chris Prest are among those hoping to take advantage of cheap Help to Buy mortgages before prices take off. But this isn't for them.
Rooms are really small for us wanting to start a family as well. I think they're just too small for us.
Is that your plan at the moment?
Well, in the next few months, yeah.
Is it your plan too, Chris?
In the next few years.
10 years ago, if you worked in Dubai and then got an 80 grand job in Canary Wharf, you'd be looking in the city. But for British high flyers like Rishi Khurana, Plaistow is the best he can get.
It's £1 million for a 1-bed flat in town, so I can't afford that anymore. So
but you're in corporate finance. You should be able to afford stuff, shouldn't you?
Well, it still means having 200k, and if you're going to buy a £1 million property, you still need 300k in the bank.
So what's your way around that?
Bank of mum and dad, like most other people there.
Not all international buyers are well heeled. Born in Vietnam and brought up in Australia, Tim Pham says he's come to Plaistow because Help to Buy has priced him out of Leytonstone.
Well, it's too hot. Because I think it make it worse because they was tightening the lending. Now they start releasing it, so everybody can get the loan, and it pushed the price up. So even as an average owner of 40,000, a year, you know, let's say for London, I don't think you can afford that sort of property in London.
Behind London's boom is a chronic shortage of property for sale and some of the cheapest mortgages ever offered. If the market's this heated here, buyers looking for better value for money are going to have to travel even further out of town.
Well, with us now is Michael Goldfarb, an American journalist who's been observing London since 1985, and Isabel Harding, editor of The Spectator's Coffee House blog. What's gone wrong in your view?
Well, it's the coming together of trends that have been going on for quite a long time. But I mean, the accelerant in all this, of course, has been Help to Buy in the last month. But really what's happened is, you know, in 2008 we had the crash, but it didn't stop, it didn't reform the financial services industry. Money's been thrown at the financial services industry. And rather than investing in things that create jobs and businesses, if you want a quick return, you might as well get into bricks and mortar, and you might as well get into bricks and mortar in London. And so what's happened is London property is no longer, it's no longer an investment in shelter for a family to make over a 25-year mortgage term. It's something for people who want to turn a quick buck. Just this weekend, Jeremy, in Hong Kong, they launched, there's a little 3-story block of flats that's gone up in the E15, and they're launching it in Hong Kong, buy it off plan, and you know, the people who buy it will never actually see the building.
No,
it's
that's
just
not healthy,
money.
is it?
No, it's not very helpful. I think it's only 28% of foreign investors who actually are non-resident in the UK, but the fact is that they are distorting the UK housing market and distorting the London housing market, and their activity has been increasing since 2007. I mean, in 2011, for instance, the amount of overseas investment in the London housing market alone was more than the total government investment in affordable housing in the whole of the UK.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's not a good thing for people who live in London who aren't operating at that sort of level. I think there's another problem here, which is supply as well, which is that the number of households is projected to grow will far outstrip supply in London. So the Communities and Local Government Department estimates that I think it's 525,000 new households in the next decade. There's nowhere near enough homes being built to match that.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is, when I was talking about a long-term problem, I mean, supply and demand, there's never been enough supply. And one of the interesting things is you hear people, I mean, conservative politicians saying the government needs to build houses. Well, the government doesn't build houses. Barratt builds houses. And what hasn't been done...
The government has built houses.
Well, but I mean, yes, I know. I live very near some Greater London Council 1930s houses, and they're wonderful. They survive. They're nice flats. But what I mean to say, Jeremy, is that, look, it's true that the planning laws are old and should be revived. What governments successively have not done is create an infrastructure that allows the free market to work. And I don't want to sound like Morris Sachi here, but I mean,
the free market is working. People are buying property.
No, the market is not working, Jeremy. The market should be about shelter for people who live in Britain.
And why should it be? That's not the market. There's a limited supply of this commodity, and there's an increasing demand. Ergo, the price goes up.
But is it a demand for shelter, or is it a demand? Is it a demand for the equivalent of a bar of gold?
Well, I think one of the really important things that politicians can do, rather than penalising those at the top who can afford to move into these high-value properties, is actually to protect those at the bottom. So I'm not so worried about the fact that I can't afford a particularly nice flat in London. It's more people who clean the offices in Parliament, who clean ministers' offices, who can't afford to live anywhere near where they work, who can't afford the train fares. It does matter. I think London has this proud heritage of being a mixed capital city. Unlike Paris, you can walk through London and walk past a council estate in the middle of Westminster. We have this amazing heritage where the founder of the largest and oldest housing association in London was an American banker, George Peabody. And that needs to be safeguarded by politicians like Boris Johnson, who need to stick to affordable housing targets and promote that sort of form of protection for people who keep the city moving and who feed the city as well.
I think one of the things that could be done is for Boris to use his bully pulpit, because we know he doesn't have that much power, but he's good on the bully pulpit, is to fight for, and rather than writing, he doesn't care. No, he was writing today about stop beating up on foreigners. I'm not beating up on foreigners here. I'm saying let's make the housing market be about housing and not about some new form of global reserve currency. There's another thing in London, and let's be clear about it. Councils are sitting on a lot of properties. Many of them are rotting away. Now, I come from New York, and in New York in the 80s when I left, I mean, the city was in very bad shape. There were a lot of houses that had been repossessed by the city. And what they did is they started selling them back to people who couldn't possibly raise a mortgage, like a dollar down, and you put sweat equity in it, and they took these houses that were off the market and turned them into dwellings. And it would be useful, I think, if councils like Hackney and Newham and Tower Hamlets started putting their houses back on the market.
Well, I think some councils are doing that anyway. Southwark Council's been selling off some of its properties to develop houses a little bit further out in places like Poplar and Limehouse. So they are trying to think creatively about how to increase the overall affordable housing supply. And to be fair to Boris, he says don't beat up foreigners, but he does have ambitious targets on affordable housing. And we can have a debate about how affordable that housing is, because it's still 80% of market rent, which is still fairly potty. But actually, at least he's got that aim to protect people who can't afford those sky-high prices.
Right, we'll leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.